Let me take the opportunity to welcome you all to this seminar on just after Holocaust Memorial Day. We've got two speakers, one of whom is Charlotte Reiner, daughter of a Holocaust survivor and teacher in a London school, who has recently written a chapter in the book The Locked Safe, a family memoir by Miriam David with Charlotte. And she's written a chapter which I'm sure she will draw on in her contribution today. She'll be followed by Nira Yuval-Davis, whom I'll introduce ever so briefly when her turn comes.
Hello, everyone. Um, this Holocaust Memorial Day, on the 27th of January, my 11-year-old son Jacob gave a speech at his Jewish primary school to talk about his great-grandparents, my father's parents, experiences in Hungary during the Nazi occupation. This was particularly meaningful as it had just been my dad, who's here listening, my dad's 80th birthday 3 days beforehand, and particularly meaningful for this year's Holocaust Memorial Day theme of bridging generations. As a second and third generation survivor, I would like to start by talking more about my family's personal experience during the Holocaust before I give some reflections about the particular importance of Holocaust Memorial Day for new generations from the perspective of a mother and a teacher. My grandmother Charlotte and my grandfather Bela lived in Hungary when the Nazis invaded in March 1944. The deportation and extermination of Hungarian Jews began and proceeded rapidly. Between May and July that year, in less than 3 months, nearly 440,000 Jews were deported from the provinces of Hungary, my grandfather Bela and his family among them. Separated from his father by a Nazi selection, my grandfather and two of his brothers were deemed able to work and were transported to a labor camp. The rest of the family, the old, women, and children, were sent straight to Auschwitz and to their deaths. In just a few months, more than half of Hungary's Jews were wiped out. The family of my grandmother Charlotte suffered equally. Charlotte, working in Budapest as a tutor for a Christian child, had established a close relationship with the child's family, and they bravely agreed to shelter her as if she were one of them. But other family members were not so fortunate. Just before the direct German occupation, Charlotte's mother, sensing what was to come, came looking for her daughter, desperate to hide with her and the Christian family. Charlotte, fearing that they would both be caught and killed, urged her mother to return to Bart. She was so terrified that it would be obvious to the Nazis that they were both Jews in hiding. Tragically, the Jews in the surrounding villages were rounded up almost immediately and taken to Auschwitz. Charlotte's mother and many other family members perished in the death camp. This guilt and loss haunted Charlotte for the rest of her life. Years later, as she lay delirious in her hospital bed dying from cancer, she cried and cried for her mother, begging for her forgiveness. With the defeat of the Nazis and the end of the war, the few surviving Hungarian Jews went looking for their remaining relatives and friends. The losses were huge. In just 8 weeks, over one-third of a million Jews from Hungary had been gassed and burned in Auschwitz. Against this backdrop of destruction and despair, my grandparents Charlotte and Bela were overjoyed to be reunited and rekindled their relationship. My father was born soon after on the 24th of January 1946. His mother would always tell him how the small Jewish community of Miskolc celebrated with joy at his birth, the hope of a Jewish baby born after so much loss and suffering. But the celebrations didn't last long. After enduring such hatred and persecution at the hands of the Nazis, Charlotte and Bela decided there remained no future for them in Hungary and were determined to leave. They managed to secure a passage on an illegal bus bound for France. The journey was terrifying for Charlotte with her cherished and beloved newborn baby. The other passengers were afraid of having a baby on board and wanted to kill him for fear he would cry when they crossed borders. Yet the bus made it safely across to France, where my father spent his first few years. Then, with the help of his older sister Rose, who had settled in London years before, Bela succeeded in gaining entry to England. The family moved over to England, full of hope for their new life and new beginnings in a new country. This hope for new beginnings brings me to the main point of Holocaust Memorial Day. Of course, Holocaust Memorial Day memorializes the 6 million Jewish people who died in this genocide, as well as commemorating the murders of disabled people, gypsies, political opponents, homosexuals, and the many other victims of the Nazis. But this commemoration, as we know, serves as an important reminder for the future. Never again. Never again should such hate and suffering occur against anyone, anywhere. And with all the current conflicts and wars, Israel and Gaza, Russia and Ukraine, never again clearly remains a vital and crucially important point to convey. But how do we? As a teacher and a mother of 2 children, I am particularly concerned with how this message is taught to children and young people. In recognition of its significance, the Holocaust has been a named topic within the school history curriculum since the first curriculum of 1991. All state schools are currently required to teach the Holocaust as part of the national curriculum in Key Stage 3, usually when pupils are 13 and 14 years old. Because as the guidelines instruct, every young person should learn about the Holocaust to help understand why and how it happened and how that is relevant today. However, as the national curriculum does not define exactly how to teach the Holocaust, teaching the topic across schools is much more complicated and very much open to teacher interpretation, and especially considering that private schools who don't follow the national curriculum aren't obligated to teach it at all. So some schools use Holocaust Memorial Day as their way of teaching the Holocaust. Some schools do whole drop-down days for whole year groups. Some teach it in just one lesson. Others teach the Holocaust through a multi-curriculum approach, and they combine it with literature, geography, religious education, as well as history. There is certainly a wealth of different resources available for teachers. I've seen it online from a variety of different organizations, which include lesson plans, schemes of learning, PowerPoint presentations, assemblies, tutorials. I was particularly moved by my son's recent Year 6 primary school assembly on Holocaust Memorial Day this year, which centered around the theme of bridging generations. He currently attends an Orthodox Jewish primary school in London, and his assembly combined facts about the Second World War, told alongside poignant personal family stories related by the great-grandchildren of survivors, and alongside pleas for peace between everyone today, no matter their race or religion. As his script reads, "We would love to live in a world where everyone is treated as equals, in a world full of positivity and hope. Even through troubling times today, we still hold on to this hope." For myself, as the child and grandchild of Holocaust refugees and survivors, I spent a lot of my childhood immersed in Holocaust literature. I remember just how engrossed and involved I became with the stories of young girls growing up in the Holocaust of a similar age to me, not just Anne Frank, but the other memoirs I read, such as Livia E. Bitten Jackson's Coming of Age in the Holocaust and Janina Bauman's Winter in the Morning. I learned the message of the Holocaust through identification with girls of a similar age who had suffered such unimaginable horrors. And even when I learned about the Holocaust more formally at secondary school and later for my French undergraduate degree, it was always a personal memoirs of victims and survivors, such as that as Elie Wiesel, which continued to hold resonance with me. Therefore, I very much believe that by encouraging young people to understand and relate to the horrors of the past, by seeing victims as people just like us, we can try to move towards better peace and harmony today and build a better world free from prejudice, discrimination, and hatred. In these troubling times with so many current conflicts, it is particularly vital to commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day alongside other tragedies of the past, and remember that in the words of Anne Frank, we are all leading lives which are different and yet the same. Bye.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Very, very moving and very, very kind of heartwarming. We'll move on to Nira. Just very briefly, Nira Yuval-Davis is a member of the JVO Education Group, an Israeli academic who's lived in Britain almost forever, or for the last 50 years or more, and was involved in the original debate about the introduction of Holocaust Memorial Day. And we'll talk about that and her experience of Holocaust Memorial Day in Israel before, and move on to make some interesting comparisons about them. Thank you very much. Nira, you're muted. You're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you very much, Charlotte. Unlike Charlotte's family, my grandparents and uncles and aunts but one and all their communities were not murdered in the concentration camps, but they were murdered in the woods near the townlet Alytus in Lithuania, where they used to live. And I want to start by illustrating how memorialization is always selective and always ideological by telling you about some years ago, we visited Lithuania and we saw these horrible holes covered by tar that were originally dug by Soviet prisoners of war, and then all the Jews were murdered into them, and it was covered. And there were 3 plaques in Russian, Lithuanian, and Yiddish next to these holes. And the guide translated these 3 plaques to us. The first one in Russia, it says, "Here buried the members of the local population murdered by the Nazis and their local helpers." The Lithuanian plaque said, "Here buried the local Jews who were murdered by the Nazis." And the Yiddish one said, "Here buried the local Jews who were murdered by the Nazis and their local helpers." So, of course, we have 3 very different kind of perspective. One which does not specify that there are Jews as the victim, one which put all the blame on the Nazis, and one which specify both that it's Jews and also specify the local cooperation by the Eisengruppe that have murdered the Jews. So this issue of memorialization has always been very not a neutral subject and very problematic. And in terms of the Holocaust Memorial Day in the UK, I want to present 2 central questions. First of all, why the Holocaust Memorial Day were introduced 50 years after the Holocaust in Britain. And secondly, why the dates of the Holocaust Memorial Day in Britain is different from the dates of the Holocaust Memorial Day in Israel. So before I, however, go to Britain, I think I should start and talk about the Holocaust Memorial Date in Israel, where, as Richard said, I grew up, and where the Holocaust Memorial Day was established in 1951, only 3 years after the establishment of the Jewish state. And the role of the Holocaust Memorial Day in Israel, I think, was generally double. First of all, it was a date for collective mourning and grief, and probably a guilt of the survivors that so many families like my own, and at that time, I think at least half of the Jewish population in Israel, or even more, have been affected by the Holocaust and its aftermath. The second goal of it was a little bit more quite different, and it is reflected at the date that Israel has chosen to commemorate the Holocaust. And this date had nothing to do with any concentration camp. It was the date of the uprising in Ghetto Warsaw. And this was a very heroic uprising led by both Zionist and anti-Zionist leaders, and of course its fate was doomed. But for the Zionist movement, which tried to establish the new Jews, which would be an antithesis to the diasporic Jews, it was very important to commemorate the Holocaust not by the death in the concentration camp, but rather by the militarized resistance and rising up to the Nazis. Because part of the Zionist ideology was, as I said, try to contrast itself, the new Jews, to the diasporic Jews, that Ben-Gurion contemporaneously called them human dust. They were seen to be passive, emasculated, and there was a suspicion, because there was incomprehension how 6 million Jews have died. Have they just gone passively like lamb to the slaughterhouse? This was a very common expression in my childhood in Israel about the Holocaust. So the whole aim of the Holocaust Memorial Day was never again to the Jews, and never again the Jews are going to be like they were in the diaspora when the Nazis and their allies committed the Holocaust. Now, in Europe and in the world in general, the concern was quite different, definitely at that time, than in Israel, because the main agonizing question that troubled people, philosophers, scholars, poets, intellectuals, as well as policymakers, were how could such a horrific thing happen under modernity, under industrial, cultural, enlightened modern society like Germany and its allies. And there was a very big debate whether or not the Holocaust is the underbelly of modernity, whether it was unique or whether it represents some normalized aspect of industrial modernity. And the agonizing, the moral agonizing found express also in the ideological and political responses to the Holocaust in the world order post Second World War. And there was a bifurcation of that response. On the one hand, we see a whole international legal and political order that is aimed in order for such a thing like the Holocaust never to happen again. There is international law, there is a convention against genocide, the International Criminal Court and International Court for Justice, the UN, the Convention Against Genocide, and UNESCO is trying to delegitimize in its early years the whole notion of what race as a valid construct has any meaning at all. This, what in the work that I'm currently doing with Ben Gidley, we called Holocaust universalist response. There was also Holocaust exceptionalist response. And this was directed and concerned
directly with the Jews, but not just with the Jews, but also accepting that the Zionist claim that Israel is to represent all the Jews in the world, whether they're Zionist or not. This is why 2/3 of the General Assembly of the UN accepted in 1947 that a Jewish state will be established in part of Palestine. This is why in the early 50s, when Germany, West Germany, decided on reparation for the Jews for the Nazi Holocaust, it gave part of the reparation to Israel as representative of all the Jews that they couldn't access directly. Things have changed and developed, of course, during the years. A major change, of course, happened in 1967 and became much more acute when, with the fall of the Soviet Union, with the end of apartheid South Africa, when the plight of the Palestinians and the Palestinian Nakba, which were quite hidden globally until then, even in the global South generally, gradually became the global front line to the confrontation between these two bifurcation responses to the Holocaust. On the one hand, and not just to the Holocaust, also to the other major racialized catastrophe of the 20th century, which is, of course, colonialism. So we have, on the one hand, a claim for universal rights for everybody and claim that the Palestinians should not be occupied and they should have their own right for self-determination and be decolonized. On the other hand, we have the continuous exceptionalist protection of Israel, which of course was not just ideological, it was strategic and political, but I'm not going to get into all this at the moment. During the Second Intifada, and especially in 2003 at the UN World Conference Against Racism in Durban in South Africa, which I actually attended, which took place 1 week before 9/11 and the declaration of global war against terrorism. There was growing validification of the Palestinian claim, and Israel felt that it is starting to lose its argument. So there started to be a very concerted effort in order to counter that. During this concerted effort, a very interesting transformation happened to the kind of memorialization of the Holocaust Memorial Day. If I said that in Israel, the aim was to emphasize the new Jews, that never again to Jews, because the Jews are not like they were before. During that time, the collapse of Israel and the Jews all over the world became transformed of Israel as the eternal victim of racism. Not the hero that resisted, but eternal victim. As the saying in Israel, always going, the whole world is against us. And this kind of message was attempted to be reinforced, and eventually the two most important products of the various diplomatic and others, not of course just by the Israel and its a lobby, and not just because of a worry about Israel, but a much more complex set of interests. We have, on the one hand, we have the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which JVL have dealt with a lot and is not the subject of the topic today. And on the other hand, has been the commemoration of the Holocaust Memorial Day as the archetype
of not just all genocide, but as Tony Blair in the opening speech in the first Holocaust Memorial Day in the UK 25 years ago, that the Holocaust has been the worst collective act of evil in history. Now, the Holocaust Memorial Day has been in quite a few countries. In Britain, it was inspired by a private MP bill after he visited Auschwitz. And yet, I forgot to mention that in a way, in the agonizing about what happened, the underbelly of modernity, it was not the Holocaust in general, but Auschwitz and other concentration and death camps that became the issue. Because the way my family was murdered was a pre-modern way. It was face to face. But the industrialization of the death in concentration camps, like in the case of Charlotte's family, Auschwitz has become the symbol. So, of course, the date that was chosen to commemorate the Holocaust Memorial Day has been not the uprising of Ghetto Warsaw, but the day that Auschwitz was liberated by the Red Army. Now, as I start to say, the Holocaust Memorial Day was a bit of an awkward attempt to combine the two bifurcated responses to the Holocaust, because although it presented the Holocaust against the Jews as the archetype of all genocides against which everything has to be compared, I mean, there were attempts to ask to make it called the Genocide Memorial Day, because from the beginning it was supposed not just to commemorate the Jewish Holocaust, but also genocides like in Rwanda, Cambodia, Bosnia. There have been a very big contestation about the genocide in Armenia, because although Raphael Lemkin, who invented the notion of genocide, who took part in the Nuremberg trials and in the establishment of the Convention Against Genocide, was inspired by what happened in Armenia during the First World War, there was a construction that, no, nothing has happened before the Holocaust. And therefore, there have been a lot of attempts in Israel, but also, I know, in Britain and in other places, not to allow the Armenian genocide to be part of the agenda. However, with the years, things and the intensification and the weaponization of anti-Semitism that we all know and thought and struggle with, things have become worse. Charlotte has described what had happened in schools this year, but what happened in the Holocaust Memorial Trust website this year, and I don't know if it's widely known, although it was written widely about in Haaretz in Israel, the term genocide was dropped from Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia. It was replaced by the term persecution-led policies. So only the Holocaust is now legitimately constructed as a genocide. Of course, this is a reaction to the attempt to include the genocide in Gaza as a whole list of other genocides that have to be commemorated during the Holocaust Memorial Day, and the attempt to completely separate and completely eternalize the Jewish Nazi Holocaust from anything else that happened in history. And we know that, as far as I know, maybe other people know differently, nowhere in the official celebrations of Holocaust Memorial Day this year, the Gaza genocide was allowed to take part. However, the issue is wider and deeper than Gaza. When the date for the Holocaust Memorial Day was chosen in Britain 25 years ago, some people said, why don't you fix the date for April 15, the date that the British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen? Why do you need to have it Auschwitz, which was by the Soviet army, the Red Army? But it was decided Auschwitz. And in addition to the whole symbolic notion of Auschwitz that I talked about, there is also the issue that Britain, unlike most of Europe, never experienced Nazi occupation except for the Channel Islands. This is why it was never an active participant in the Holocaust policy that happened, except in the Channel Islands, and this have been attempted always kind of to cover up and marginalize. So there was this kind of notion, we the Brits are so much better than anybody else. So the commemoration of the Holocaust Memorial Day in Britain has become some kind of an abstract humanism, but it's not something that we take part of. At the same time, there is no anti-racism day in Britain, and as I said, even not anti-genocide in Britain. There have not been, I mean, in the United States, there is the Martin Luther King Day. There have not been deep reflection. There are attempts by like the university and so on, but attempts to go back to examine British responsibility in relation to its history, atrocities, and genocide. So the Holocaust Memorial Day, although of course for families like Charlotte and others, it's still an important kind of day to commemorate and grieve in terms of the personal history. In terms of an attempt, like in other European countries, to reflect upon its historical past and responsibility to what happened, is lacking in Britain. So in this way, I think the issue in Britain of the Holocaust Memorial Day is even more problematic and more ideological and more selective than anywhere else. And I think I'll stop now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nira. That's absolutely fascinating. Both contributions, a kind of a richness and a complexity, which is clearly missing from most of the discussion you get about Holocaust Memorial Day in Britain. Do either of you want to ask each other anything before we open it to general discussion?
No.
No. Okay. Does anyone want to be the first to go? Right. Robert Reiner.
He's my dad,
Please
so I knew.
Unmute yourself. And Daniel, can you arrange this so we can see the speaker or pin it? Or do we have to pin it ourselves?
Hello. Hi. Okay, well, thanks very much. I found both presentations riveting and moving. So thanks very much for arranging the whole event. As Charlotte described, my own personal and family experience was, really traumatized by what happened in the Holocaust. As she described, I was actually conceived while my parents were searching to see who had survived and so on. And there was obviously they were deeply traumatized, and no doubt that transmitted itself to me. And then I was brought up in a community that was largely consisted of Holocaust survivors. But they tried very hard. I mean, this is so well documented that they didn't talk about it. They tried very hard not to traumatize me, to avoid my having any contact with the memories of the Holocaust. And I didn't really learn about it until I was an adult. And then they started to speak to me about it. But no doubt, my whole 80 years, as Charlotte said, my birthday was last week, has been traumatized by that awful experience. And although I certainly didn't want to pass it on to my children, I'm absolutely sure that it has passed on to a large extent. But the question I wanted to ask is really that what occurs to me after hearing both talks is that there's a difficult tightrope to walk between different bad things. On the one hand, there is what, at its best, and Nira rightly emphasized the kind of very, I would say, almost sordid reasons why the Holocaust Memorial Day developed in the UK and the US and elsewhere, very much with regard to, and certainly has become a part of current, the current gallop towards the right in all these countries. But I think the tightropes are, on the one hand, how to keep alive some memory of what was, after all, as both speakers have said, it's not that there aren't other parallels or other victims, even of the 1940s Holocaust, than the Jews, but certainly it was, in quantitative terms, very much a Jewish tragedy at that time, and it still probably dwarfs in scale all the other terrible genocides and so on, not in history, but in recent times. But so on the one hand, we want to keep, I think it's important to keep some notion alive of how awful, how evil things can become, and as a lesson to try and avoid that happening when, in fact, the world right now is galloping towards some repetition of it, I fear. But the second tightrope is this: how to avoid further generations like mine, and to a small extent, I hope, only Charlotte's, but then, a fortiori, my grandchildren and so on, how to avoid passing on the trauma, because that also is a bad thing, in my view. So what is the answer? Perhaps Charlotte would have some views on that. How as a teacher and mother, how do you hope to, on the one hand, commemorate what happened in your own immediate family, but on the other hand, without passing on the depth of trauma?
Thank you, Robert. Charlotte, do you want to come back? I think probably.
Oh, or Nira as well, if she wants to.
Oh,
Go ahead.
Well, how to avoid it? I mean, I don't think by suppressing it. I think it's important to talk about it, but as a way to inculcate empathy and concern for all victims, and not just focus on the unique suffering, but by talking about it in a way to make it present. I don't know if Nira wants to say something. You said you.
Yeah, I fully agree with what you say. And as a sociologist of racism, my work with my students to try and explain to them that there are many different kinds of racism have become much easier after the Holocaust study has been introduced to school curriculum. I understand the problematic of the curriculum that you talked about it before. Yeah. And of course, there have been a lot of kind of misinformation. But before it was introduced in the British curriculum, my students were completely ignorant about it. And while they knew better than to fall into basic stereotypes concerning Blacks and a little bit Roma, very often towards Jews, there was a complete ignorance and repetition of stereotypes. And when I told them that I was Jewish, there was usually a very shocked response to that. But in terms of the commemoration within families and not kind of the trauma, I think you're right, not by suppressing. But of course it forms inevitably our identities. It's not me, but only me, but even my parents never knew what actually happened to their parents and siblings and communities until 1956, when the only survivor came from Hungary, actually. And he told my parents, he survived because his grandfather covered his body with him when they were trying to check if anybody remained alive in this horrible hole. So this has been a horrible thing which affected me deeply, but it affected me deeply in the terms that, like you said, never again, but not just for Jews, but for everybody. And that's what made me a political activist.
Thanks, Nira. We've got a number of people with their hands up. We'll take a few contributions and then come back to the speakers. Leah, then Carmen, then Jonathan. Leah, can you unmute?
Yes, thank you. And sorry, I haven't changed my name. Thank you both very much for the talks. I found them both very fascinating. So if I can just take a minute or two to say, what I live in Hastings, and I went as a member of Hastings Jews for Justice to sort of look at what was happening, because we cannot get permission to run the Holocaust Memorial Day event here, and I can see it would just become politically impossible. And first of all, I want to say they had the most wonderful speaker. It's a woman called Eva Clark, which some of you may have heard of. She was literally born on the ramp at Mauthausen on the 28th of April, 1945. She was completely wonderful. But she was also the only person who mentioned any victims other than Jews. She didn't go into great details because she's telling her story as a Jewish survivor. She also drew parallels of that when she made the point that when she came here with her British stepfather, they came legally, and she said, but I could have been come as a refugee or as an asylum seeker. So I thought it was very telling that she did, as Nira put it, like some generalist lessons, even though the power of her story, if you don't know her story, I don't know how I missed it. It's amazing. And there's YouTube things, and do look it up, Eva Clark. But it was so much only about Jews, and their comments on the pamphlet, it had the chief rabbi, and it's all because, of course, the terrible things that happened in Manchester and in Bondi. It's like it's all happening again to the Jews. So there is this thing about how do we get the generalist, universalist sort of principles? And I can say that actually, certainly as co-chair of JVL and a couple of, we got a letter from Mark Etkin, who some of you might know. He coordinates the Holocaust survivors and descendants who stand, as they did yesterday, in the marches against the genocide. And he told us about this drama group I think in Harlow, don't quote me on that, where they'd created this youth group, which I think includes young people with learning disabilities, or with disabilities, who of course would also have been victims of the Nazis. And they mentioned Gaza. All hell broke loose. The group has lost their funding. I mean, within days, the Tory MP has taken himself off the board, blah, 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 blah. So I'm not sure that I have a direct question, but I would be interested in your comments. It's like, it feels to me that and it links to the weaponization of anti-Semitism, the IHRA definition, because to me it's a profound wickedness to whip up that understandable fear of my families, people who, as many people here tonight are descended from Holocaust survivors, to whip that fear up seems to be something that we must find a way of resisting, because it's a wickedness. in addition to the specializing, making an exception of anti-Semitism, like it's the worst form of racism. It's, you know, so I'm interested in your comments on it, but it's not a direct question. So enough. But thank you.
Thank you, Leo. We'll take a couple more and then we'll come back to the speakers. Carmen, can you unmute?
Yes. Firstly, many thanks to both the speakers and to you, Voice for Liberation, for organizing.
Sorry, we're losing you. Carmen, I'll have to ask you to do it. It froze again and we're unable to catch the question.
Okay.
Try once more.
Shall I type it?
Yes,
I type it?
yes, if you put it into the chat, that would be
But
great.
you have to open the chat.
I will get the question out of the chat, don't worry, and present
I
it.
have. Okay.
Okay. And in the meantime, we'll move on to Jonathan. Okay.
Okay. Yes. I spoke for the Jewish bloc at the big march yesterday, and I chose to speak about Holocaust Memorial Day, which had only been 4 days previously. So this has been very much in my mind in preparing for that event. And I found first of all, the two presentations fascinating, and also the discussion since. What I find significant is the deployment of the Holocaust as a political card to play in the defense of Israel. And I find this absolutely shocking and totally disgusting. The beginning perhaps was the Durban conference, but also then the success subsequently to the Second Intifada of the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. And then Israel organized itself with a special ministry set up to counter the success of BDS in particular. And the strategy was to delegitimize the delegitimizers. So there became a fight not about what Israel was doing, but about people like many of those people here who were critical of Israel and were forced onto the defensive. And Holocaust and Holocaust Memorial Day seem to have been deployed as part of that whole exercise. The IHRA definition is an example. Now, IHRA definition wasn't originally the IHRA definition, it was the EUMC definition with a European label on it. And it got nowhere. When they persuaded, in fact, they didn't really persuade the IHRA to adopt it, but the people who ran IHRA cheated and pretended that it had been passed. People probably know that story. But it has been used in all that way. And we have not found an effective way of regaining that part of the narrative. I had a talk earlier today because JVL is part of an international group called Global Jews for Palestine, and I'm talking with one of the other activists there about the fact that the Holocaust museums, which exist all around the world, not one of them has ever been able to say anything at all about what's going on in Gaza, despite the fact they've had 2 years to think about this genocide. And there is a case to be made, I think, for taking that as a priority, a new possible target for us. In Britain, we don't have a Holocaust Museum, but we do have this plan for the Holocaust Education Centre next to Parliament, which will serve the same function, but with even less breadth of coverage, I suspect, than the existing work at which is the museum just south of the river that covers the Holocaust quite well historically, but it's not a political activity. And I think that we should. We could think about what we could do to both to fight that attempt to spatchcock a monstrous and massive building right next to Parliament. They've had to pass special acts of Parliament to make it possible to build there, and I think that's a possible fight we should take on.
Thank you, Jonathan. Let's go back to the speakers. The two questions we've had are kind of obviously closely related. Either of you want to come in with thoughts? Could you unmute, Charlotte? If... Not letting you.
Sorry. Do you have the question by Carmen?
Not yet.
Still
wait.
Okay, Charlotte, do you want to go ahead? Or?
She can't unmute. Oh, there we are.
No,
That's
am I
fine.
unmuted? Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, Nira, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I thank Jonathan for mentioning BDS, which of course is a very important player in what I was talking about, and this is important. But I also, like him and like Leah, feel this sense. I wouldn't say defeat. I mean, generally, of course I feel defeat. All our life struggle to make everything better is like such an utter failure with what is happening now in the world. But it's specifically in relation to the weaponization of the issue of anti-Semitism, and more specifically even as the deployment of the Holocaust, which is such a traumatic, horrific thing, into a cynical tool and instrument, which, as I said, completely inverted and transformed the whole self-understanding of the Zionist movement in relation to new beginnings and never again and so on. So I don't necessarily have any specific answer, except of course that we should try and fight this continuous narrowing of what it means. One of the members of the Holocaust Memorial Trust that I described, Melanie Goldberg, who is a member of Standing Together, was fired from the trust because she mentioned Gaza, and she thought that one needs to, in the celebration, talk about this. So I absolutely agree about the so-called Holocaust Education Center in relation to the parliament, but the mere fact that the parliament has passed this kind of act that enabled this to happen, I must say, maybe a specific struggle has more chance to succeed, but I kind of see the more overwhelmed by the whole general thing, that even the attempts to make a Holocaust Memorial Day hierarchical but inclusive is now getting completely lost. So must say I'm not very optimistic.
Thanks, Nira. Charlotte, do you want to add anything?
No, I'm not at the moment. So.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Let's go back. Carmen, your question hasn't come through in chat, but do you want to have another go at seeing if you can ask it? And in the meantime, let's take Andrew and then hopefully Carmen. Andrew, could you unmute?
Does that do it?
Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, I was interested in this question about this building next to Parliament and the museum, about how one should deal with this, particularly when you see the fat hand of Eric Pickles in this. It's also, of course, then related to the IHRA, as people will know. Pickles was the leader of the British delegation, and of course, a lot of the Holocaust Education Trust people were involved in that delegation, and not only have, if you like, not come clean on what happened. I mean, I personally wrote to all the members of it. None of them would reply. And I asked very simple questions. Did this happen? What was the vote on this? How did this take place? How was this organized? No reply. Nobody would do that. And in fact, on that, which is not, of course, not the central subject today, I did ask, all the members who participated. Nobody would reply, of course, least of all somebody like Pickles. Okay, but really, what I wanted to say is, on the question of trauma. I can't really say that I'm in favour of trauma, but I don't think what Rob Reiner is talking about wants to be avoided. I mean, do I suffer from the trauma, if you like, transmitted by my parents, both of whom escaped the Holocaust? They managed to get out just before. And of course, the vast majority of my family didn't, and of course they perished. I don't think one ought to be fighting the trauma, if that's a phrase that you could use. It's absolutely part of our lives, and it's an important part of our lives. In a sense, one wants to transmit the depth of it. It's like the inked tattoos. You can't wipe it away. And you don't, in a way, I mean, there are people perhaps that did want to wipe it away and they were involved, and one can understand why. But if you like, as people interested in history, we're also memorialists. We want to keep it there. We want to keep the public looking at that issue. Trauma or no trauma, I think it's important. I would say for myself, it's not that it's confession time, but I say for myself, it is an almost daily presence. I mean, I think about it in one way or another. When I'm tired, I think of those who, although they were exhausted, had to continue or be murdered. When I'm cold, I think of those in such terrible conditions that could do nothing about their cold, and I find that a reference point. In the future, it may not be such a, if you like, such a hot reference point, but it will be something that people will know about. And so if that's passing on the trauma, well, let's pass on the trauma. I would be interested to know how people think one ought to relate to this matter that Jonathan Rosenhead, for example, spoke about. I think it's difficult. It's difficult on all these things to say, no, we're not going to participate. No, we condemn it. There has to be a rather more nuanced approach, and it's difficult to know exactly how that should be handled. Okay, that's all I wanted to say.
Thanks. We have the question from Carmen in the chat, and it's a big one. Are white Zionists setting up Jews as the future scapegoats for the failures of neo-imperialism and globalization? Would the genocide in Gaza be used in the future to justify a future genocide against the Jews? Think about it. Let me take one more contribution. We'll then get the speakers back in. The next one hand up is Paul Crofts. Could you unmute? Thank you, Paul.
Yes, just to say that what it's a great meeting, and I'm really pleased that the speaker. I've learned a lot from the speaker. Perhaps it'd be helpful if I say where I'm coming from. I started the first Holocaust Memorial Day event in Wellingborough in Northamptonshire on the same day that everybody else launched it nationally. So I participated in that, but it was through the organisation I worked for at the time, which was Northamptonshire Rights and Equality Council. And it was organised by us as an event because the local council at that time refused to organise it themselves, which is what the government, I think, wanted to happen. So right from the beginning, Holocaust Memorial Day had universalist themes as well as, also a focus on the Holocaust and its uniqueness, both for Jews and for others who were murdered in the Holocaust. So right from the beginning, we also were talking about the lessons to be learned from it and looking at other genocides. And we held exhibitions, we held talks, we held a memorial event. And so right from the beginning, the contradictions between the two, the universalist and the exceptionalist positions were together and not seen as contradictions. But as time evolved, the following year, the council did take it on and they organised it. And once they organised it, it became more problematic because they followed, in a sense, the positions from the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust and the and also from other organisations who clearly had much more of much more of a narrow focus on the Holocaust itself, as opposed to learning lessons from the Holocaust. But it's interesting. So I became more and more uncomfortable over the years when it narrowed, although the Holocaust Memorial Day Committee in Wellingborough was composed of some really good people who continued to fight for the universalist perspective. Things have changed since the current genocide in Palestine and in Gaza. Last year, there was an oblique reference to Gaza by one of the speakers, but it was very oblique, and he would say it was very sensitively said. So he didn't want to be controversial, but it was referred to. This year, however, it's very interesting. This year, the event was organised not by the council. They kind of offloaded organising the Holocaust Memorial Day events and the exhibitions and things around it to the interfaith panel in Wellingborough, which was really interesting because they were quite prepared to take on this issue of Gaza, and indeed went out of their way to find a speaker who would speak on that issue. And so this year, it was a very different Holocaust. There was a speaker who was an active member of Palestine Solidarity who spoke at the Holocaust Memorial Day event, having been invited by the group that organises it. And it changed the whole composition of it for me and for many other people who'd been increasingly feeling uncomfortable. They were now prepared to address that. Now, what will happen next year, I don't know. But I just thought that experience, whether Wellingborough was exceptional here, and also an event which has continued from the early days, which was organised by Northamptonshire Rights and Equality Council, along with the local synagogue in Northampton, was an annual lecture. And again, there's been some really interesting speakers invited by the Rights and Equality Council and hosted by the synagogue. So the lecture takes place in the synagogue. And this year, the lecture is about the Roma and the Sinti who were murdered in the Holocaust. So it's a very specific focus, which is refocusing on another group that was part of the Holocaust and continues to be persecuted. So I just wanted to say that it is possible, but it might be particular to this area, I don't know. But once it was not organised by the local council, it's organised by the Rights and Equality Council or the Interfaith Panel or other people who were much more open in their approach to, and took the declaration of the Holocaust Memorial Day, the declaration which formed that, and take it as it's what it says, then you can actually incorporate the universalist perspective very much in it, and about learning lessons, about what are the causes of the Holocaust and genocides, and you can also relate it to the present day in terms of the rise of reform, the far right, and what have you. So I just thought I'd make that contribution to say it is possible to do it, and we shouldn't lose faith in keeping that tradition alive.
Thank you very much, Paul. Absolutely fascinating contribution. We'll take some more and then come back to the speakers towards the end. Okay. Mickey, could you unmute?
Yes, hello, and thank you for this fascinating and stimulating discussion. I wanted to take up the point slightly differently from the way Paul Croft just raised the issue about trying to make Holocaust more universalize the discussions about different forms of racisms, and in particular to take up the issue about the memorial in Westminster Gardens, about which there's been so much bad blood, essentially, about emphasizing that above all others, because there's never been any debate about having a memorial to slavery or to the victims of slavery. And this was raised quite a lot 3 or 4 years ago, or at the time of the Colston statue being thrown into the river in Bristol. And there was a momentum for arguing for work being done on the British major issue of slavery and its involvement in it. And it's extraordinary to me that that debate is still not taken forward by comparison with the way in which, as Nira put so well, the British are trying to claim some sort of moral virtue about the Holocaust. And so I'll leave it as an addendum to the discussions that we've been having.
Thank you, Mickey. Robert, could you unmute?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, apologies, I can't get my camera to work, but I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
And I wanted to say really something parallel to what Miriam has just said about the what's omitted in terms of genocidal historical behaviours, but also I'd like to thank everybody, particularly Nira and Charlotte, for what they've said and the how strongly that's been put. So what I wanted to say about the kind of history is that when the Genocide Convention was drawn up in the period after 1945, it deliberately excluded earlier genocides, and people may be familiar with Philip Sand's book East-West Street. He talks about that in some detail, because the USA and the UK specifically did not want this history, the history which Miriam's just mentioned about slavery and colonialism. They did not want that to be included. And of course, the proposal for the Holocaust Memorial Library, David Cameron, when he committed government money to that, described the proposed memorial as, quote, a permanent statement of our values as a nation. So the kind of ideological embedding of the heroic role of Britain, allegedly, is part and parcel of this. And of course, it serves, I think, to obscure what would be actually a mistaken guilt about the history, because I think it's fundamentally wrong for us to read history as a story of either shame or guilt. I think and maybe this comes to the issue of how we deal with the question of trauma, because there are the Zionists seem to have embraced victimhood, and it's become almost a part of Zionist identity, and I think we have to tackle that head on. We have to argue that actually history we each have to take a stand. Which side would we have been on in these historical events, and the choices that we are making now about how we memorialize or not the other genocides are the same issues that people have faced throughout history. I just wanted to say finally, we in Manchester, we on Holocaust Memorial Day, 19 of us assembled at St. Peter's Square near the cenotaph and specifically addressed, when I say of us, that's members of JVL and Manchester Palestine Action, and also we invited Narmad, who came as well, and we specifically addressed the genocide in Gaza. It didn't, as I'm sure you're not surprised to hear, it didn't get any local wide coverage or national coverage. It did get some alternative newspaper coverage, but I think, following on, I think from what Paul said, maybe we need to be talking to each other locally and finding ways that we can build solidarity with the groups who've been excluded from talking about their own genocides and building that together. I think that's the answer to the kind of the victimhood that the Zionists are embracing. We need to, if we feel we can be active and take action and build solidarity, it's a small way of starting to tackle what I acknowledge is this difficult and disempowering feeling of trauma, but I think it's an important first step. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Robert. Can I just throw in something from the chat from Nicola Grove, who says she was very interested in the change from genocide to persecution led, and she looked at the site and emailed them. This was 2 weeks ago, and at that point, genocide as a word was still there, not any longer. Look, time is moving on. Are there any final questions or contributions? Let's take them, because when we bring our speakers back, we won't really have time for another round. Anyone want to say anything further?
What about Carmen's question?
Well, it's there. No, I read it out,
Yes.
and I'm hoping it will be addressed. And indeed, I mean, just to point out that I have seen some MAGA spokespeople on the right who have become critical of Israel, extremely critical of Israel, not just the guy who was shot, but a number of others. And they really are false friends, I have to say. But others, all right, let's go to our two speakers. Do you want to start, Charlotte? Any reflections on any of these questions? You don't have to cover everything. Would you unmute?
Yeah, I'm unmuted.
Yes.
Oh, thanks so much. Well, I agree about the point about trauma and not to suppress it and to make it part of reality today and learning from it. I also think about in schools, a way to generalize everything is really by bringing everyone together and reading from perspectives of different races and getting down the boundaries. I'm not sure. I think Nira seems to have something more to say. I'll pass over to Nira. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Nira.
First of all, I want to thank Paul and Robert for making me feel a little bit less despondent and more optimistic. So maybe this is the start of a new wave of resistance because of what Mark Carney called about the rapture. So now we can try and confront the rapture, and maybe common sense and some kind of universal sense of morality will come back to celebrate. In terms of the trauma, I agree, and I agree that we don't have to feel shame or guilt, but we do have to feel responsibility. And what Mickey was talking about, the issue of slavery and others, I mean, that was the whole point of what I'm making. Just last point, indeed, the whole debate about Armenia genocide was because it did happen within the 20th century. And as Robert mentioned, Philip Sen book, it's the whole debate was about what happened in the 20th century rather than before, because of the histories of the US and the UK. But of course, they are not alone. Although they've been very powerful and in this sense affected more than many others. And that brings me to the question of Carmen. Already in the early 80s, I published, and I had to fight for a whole year for them to allow me to publish it in the then major feminist journal, Spare Rib, an article about anti-Semitism, Zionism, and the fight against racism. And what I said then, and I warned, and I said that this collapse of Israel and the Jews, constructing Israel as a collective Jew, in the long run is going to contribute to anti-Semitism rather than to lessen it. Because if to be anti-Semitic is to criticize what is happening to the Palestinian, then maybe anti-Semitism is not such a bad thing. This non-separation, this kind of right or wrong with a victim, rather than having a critical solidarity and separation, is absolutely a crucial step, not only in our politics, but in any kind of attempt to reconcile this universalist and exceptionalist approach. Because of course, people who are vulnerable have to be protected, but this does not give them license to do everything and for eternity, right or wrong, to be protected. Like the Prime Minister of Germany during the Gaza genocide, and this is very significant because in the same week when Israel attacked Iran, he said Israel is doing our dirty work. And then he also said Israel is our special responsibility, so we have to continue to protect it, and therefore we cannot criticize their policies. So the combination of the so-called moral and the political and the interest and all the strategic and political issues which are so entangled in the whole issue, not only of attitudes to Israel, but the weaponization of anti-Semitism on various scales, as we know, from the Labour Party to more national to more global issues, is something that we need to continue to look at, analyze, criticize, and resist.
Can I just say one other thing? There is Black History Month, which is in primary schools at the moment. They do have quite a lot on the Black history and things like that. Just that's in response to my mother. She knows, so she can answer that if she wants to.
Yeah, but it's Black history.
Perhaps not as much as
it's Black history. It's not Britain paying reparation to slavery like Germany.
Yes, of course.
Or even kind of recognizing. Of course, this has been a very important tool. The Black history, but there is no date of anti-racism, which is universal.
Yes, yeah.
There's no date about anti-genocide, which is universal. So,
that's true. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Can I just say there's one point made in the comments by Carmen again, who points out that the massacre in German Southwest Africa, Namibia, was the first genocide of the 20th century, and indeed had incredibly important links back into the Nazi Party and the genocide in the Second World War.
And Germany and the UN recognized it, but Germany never offered reparation to Namibia, unlike to the Germans. And when South Africa established the whole issue of genocide to the International Court of Justice, Germany tried to resist it and say, we know what is genocide and you're not going to tell them. And then Namibia told them, you know what is genocide? We know what is genocide by you, and you never offered us the and kind of tried to delegitimate. However, I want to say, as a contributor to my general pessimism, the same South Africa that started the case of genocide about Gaza called its own artists 10 days before the Venice Biennale, which was supposed to be about Gaza, as too polarizing, and therefore he was called back. So what kind of pressures South Africa had to give up? So I don't think on the state levels we have many allies. It's more grassroots of the left, north and south, yeah.
Well, I'd like to thank the speakers very much and also the questions and the comments. It's been a very fascinating, informed, nuanced discussion of an incredibly important issue and one that certainly is not going to go away. We will be here next year facing the same issues and the same questions. And let's hope we've been able to make some progress or gain some insights or mount some campaign somewhere that begin to turn the tide. Thanks very much to everyone.